The candle flickered in the stone chamber. A monk sat hunched over parchment, his quill scratching slowly across the page. Outside, a man screamed. The monk did not flinch. He simply wrote faster. This was the work of the church, not prayer, not salvation, documentation, every sin, every crime, every whispered confession in the dark. It all went into the records, and once it was written, it could never be erased. The medieval church did not forgive men. It remembered them. They had catalogued their failures, their weaknesses, their darkest secrets. And when the time came, it used those records like weapons. In the villages of medieval Europe, the priest was not just a holy man. He was a spy. He was a collector of information. Every Sunday, peasants lined up to confess their sins. They believed they spoke to God, but they spoke to an institution that listened very carefully. The priest heard everything: a wife's hatred for her husband, a serf's stolen bread, a young man's lust for another man's daughter. These were not just spiritual matters. They were intelligence. They were leverage. And the priest wrote it all down. Not every confession was recorded, of course. Small sins were absolved and forgotten. But the larger ones, the dangerous ones, those found their way into parish registers, into episcopal archives, into the vast bureaucratic memory of the church. A man might confess to heretical thoughts, to doubting the resurrection, to questioning the Pope. The priest would nod. He would assign penance. He would offer absolution. And then, late at night, he would add that man's name to a list that could destroy him years later. The church understood something that kings often forgot. Power was not just about swords and armies. Power was about knowledge, about knowing who was vulnerable, about knowing who could be controlled. And so the church built the greatest information network in medieval history. Monasteries across Europe served as archives. Monks copied documents endlessly: birth records, death records, marriage records, land disputes, criminal accusations, excommunication orders. It was all preserved. It was all organized. It was all accessible to those who knew where to look. A bishop could request information about a noble family 3 kingdoms away. Within weeks, he would know their alliances, or their debts, their scandals, their sins. No king had this power, no lord, only the church. The confession booth was a masterpiece of psychological design, a small enclosed space, darkness, anonymity, or at least the illusion of it. The penitent could not see the priest's face. This made confession easier. It made men speak freely. But the priest could see everything. He could hear the trembling in a man's voice. He could sense guilt before words were spoken. And he was trained to ask questions, probing questions, questions designed to extract more than the penitent intended to give. You say you stole grain. From whom did you steal it? You say you felt anger toward your Lord. What did you imagine doing to him? You say you doubted. Tell me exactly what you doubted. The penitent believed he was unburdening his soul. He was actually building a case file against himself. This system served many purposes. It maintained social order. The peasants who confessed to rebellious thoughts could be watched. Serfs who admitted to theft could be reported to their lords. The church acted as a silent enforcer of the feudal hierarchy, but it also served the church's own interests. When a bishop wanted to remove a troublesome priest, he consulted the records. When a pope wanted to humble a defiant king, he searched the archives. When the Inquisition came to a town, it did not start from nothing. It started with lists, names, accusations, confessions from years or even decades past. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made annual confession mandatory for all Christians. This was presented as a spiritual requirement, a pathway to salvation. But it was also a surveillance mandate. Every adult in Christendom was now required to submit to interrogation at least once a year. Those who refused were noted. Those who avoided confession were suspected. And suspicion in the medieval world was often enough to destroy a life. The records grew. Generation after generation, the Church remembered what families wanted to forget. A grandfather's heresy could haunt his grandchildren. A mother's adultery could taint her descendants for a century. The Church did not believe in fresh starts. It believed in inheritance, spiritual inheritance. The sins of the fathers passed to the sons. This was doctrine, but it was also strategy. A family that owed spiritual debts to the Church was a family that could be controlled. They would donate land to monasteries. They would fund cathedral construction. They would send their sons into holy orders, all to cleanse a stain that the Church itself kept alive. Forgiveness was always available, for a price. The price might be gold. It might be loyalty. It might be silence when silence was needed. But there was always a price. The Inquisition perfected this system. When inquisitors arrived in a region, they did not simply ask who the heretics were. They brought records with them, old accusations, old confessions, old suspicions. A man might have lived peacefully for 20 years. He might have attended Mass every Sunday. He might have given generously to the poor. None of it mattered. If his name appeared in the records, he was already condemned. The inquisitors would summon him. They would read back his own words from decades past. Words he had forgotten. Words he had confessed in what he believed was sacred confidence. And they would ask him to explain. There was no good explanation. There was only guilt. Guilt that had been patiently preserved, waiting for the moment when it would be useful. Some tried to escape the records. They fled to distant lands. They changed their names. They started new lives. But the Church's network was vast. Priests communicated across borders. Bishops exchanged information. Monasteries kept copies of important documents in multiple locations. A man might run to the edge of the known world, and still his past could follow him. The Church had invented something that would not exist in secular form for centuries: a permanent, searchable, international database of human behavior. And it used this database with ruthless efficiency. Not all churchmen were comfortable with this system. Some priests genuinely believed in the sanctity of confession. They refused to record what they heard, and they destroyed documents they considered too dangerous. They protected their parishioners from the institution they served. These priests were rare, and they were often punished. The church hierarchy understood that information was power. A priest who refused to share information was a priest who could not be trusted. He might be transferred to a remote parish. He might be denied advancement. In extreme cases, he might face accusations himself. The system protected itself. It rewarded those who fed it information. It destroyed those who withheld it. By the late medieval period, the Church's archives had grown beyond comprehension. The Vatican alone contained documents stretching back centuries, records of every major political event, records of every significant family in Europe, records of heresies, scandals, crimes, and secrets that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. This was the true treasury of the Church. Not gold, not land, not even faith. Information. Popes used this information to manipulate emperors. Bishops used it to control nobles. Priests used it to dominate villages. The entire structure of medieval society rested, in part, on the Church's ability to remember what everyone else wanted to forget. The medieval peasant understood this instinctively. He knew that his confession was not truly private. He knew that his words might be used against him some day, and yet he confessed anyway, because he had no choice. That to refuse confession was to be marked as a heretic. To lie in confession was to damn one's soul. The only option was to speak truthfully and hope that the priest was merciful, hope that the records would never be consulted, hope that his sins would be forgotten. But the Church did not forget. It wrote everything down. It stored everything away. It waited. And when the moment came, when a man was vulnerable, when he was useful, when he was in the way, the Church opened its archives. It found his name. It read his sins, and it did not forgive. It simply remembered. The candle burned low in the stone chamber. The monk finished his final entry. He sprinkled sand across the wet ink. He closed the heavy book. Tomorrow there would be more confessions, more secrets, more names to add to the endless list. The work of the Church was never finished, because men kept sinning. And the Church kept writing. It always kept writing.